Welcome to the the Center for Philosophy of Science annual lecture series lecture. Edward is away. I'm stepping in on his behalf. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Christian Andrews is a professor at the University of York, and it's the York that's in Canada, and specifically Toronto, right? And so she's come to us from a background both in the Department of Philosophy and very involved, sometimes director of the Cognitive Science program there as well. She has been working on anthropomorphism, on false belief explanation, on folk psychology, and she doesn't limit herself to our particular form of primate, but in fact studies both humans and other great apes. I like that, great apes and other great apes, other orangutans and other primates. Her book in 2012 from MIT was "Do Apes Read Minds? Towards a New Folk Psychology," and it won the CPA Book Prize in 2013. She has a lot of different articles that all look fabulous, and you want to read them, including Orangutan Pantomime, Elaborating the Message. I mean, these are like really fun, telling stories without words. These are all fabulous, and I encourage you to go and look her up and read her work. But for now, we get the great pleasure of hearing her talk to us today on normative practice in other animals, other than us animals.
Other than us, yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation and the introduction.
Which one is it? The last one.
All right, I thought I'd start with a roadmap because I'm telling a little story today, and I want to make sure everybody knows where we're going, and I'll give you some reminders along the way so you don't get lost by the dialectic. So I'm going to start with a question, asking a question: is morality cultural rather than merely natural? I'm going to answer that with a yes. And then I'm going to answer the next question: are animals cultural? With a yes, despite some recent arguments otherwise. And then given that kind of foundation, what I want to do is examine this question: do animals have a moral or normative cultural technology? And to do that, I'm going to have to draw a distinction between the moral and the normative. And then I'm going to look at the normative and ask two questions about the normative. One, about the cognitive capacities that would be necessary for normative practice, and then the other will be social norms that give evidence of normative practice. And then the conclusion, so this is not a mystery novel, you won't be surprised, sorry. I'm going to say that I think that there is sufficient evidence for us to conclude that animals, some non-human animals, engage in normative practice, but right now we don't yet have evidence that animals engage in full-blown moral practice, given the way I demarcate those two. And I should say that this is kind of a sketch of a project I'm just starting. So I don't have all the answers now. You get to see my preliminary thoughts on this. This is part of a 5-year SSHRC grant project. And I've been working on it with some of my PhD students and postdocs. And so I will refer to them throughout as well, the work that they've done on this. But now that you've got the roadmap, I want to start by going back over 2,000 years to ancient China, to this historical debate between two philosophers, Mengzi and Sunzi. So Mengzi argued that human nature is good, that we have, all of us when we're born, we have these shoots of morality, sprouts of morality, and all we have to do is not stamp on them, not pull them up, nurture them with water and fertilizer, and we'll be good. It's like water running downhill. As long as you don't dam it up, you'll be good. But Sunzi argued that human nature isn't naturally good, He says, sure, it's true that we've got these, kind of sprouts of emotional response. One of Mengzi's famous stories was a child falling down a well. How are you going to respond? Of course, your first response is going to be one of concern for the child. So Sun Tzu doesn't deny that, but he points out that it's also in the nature of humans to be born with a fondness for profit. They're born with hates and dislikes. And that's why people will inevitably fall into conflict and struggle if they simply follow along with their nature and their dispositions. So we have this problem with both good sprouts and bad sprouts. And what we need to do in order to develop a moral behavior is to create rituals that we follow. And the sages were very wise. They discovered these rituals that we are to follow, and this created morality. He uses the analogy of agriculture. When the early humans saw, weather and plants and animals and so on, at first they didn't know what to do, but then they developed understanding of regularities, and they started cultivating the land and animals and so on and so forth. And what is natural was not good, because they were dying, eating poison, and et cetera, et cetera. But the artifice was what was good and helpful for the humans. And Sun Tzu thinks that this is the sort of way we should think of morality, too, as the product of ritual that has been created over time. Now, when we look at discussions in contemporary animal cognition research on animal morality, it seems that Frans de Waal is the Mengzi of the 21st century. Frans de Waal, many of you have heard him talk or seen TED Talks. He's a primatologist who argues that chimpanzees and some other animals like dolphins and elephants have the shoots of morality, these sprouts of morality, that there's evidence of reconciliation in all of the social mammals that have been studied so far, except for domestic cats. So after a fight, they'll make up, except for cats. We've seen this in spotted hyenas and lions and dolphins and the dwarf mongoose and domestic goats and domestic dogs. Frans de Waal has argued that we see affective empathy in across species. So I just put up a picture here of the field or prairie vole. These are monogamous mammals, and scientists have recently done a study where they separated a dyad pair, and when they would bring them back, reunite them, if the female had been stressed while they were separated, the male would engage in more licking behavior and also would have a higher oxytocin response than if she hadn't been stressed out when they were separated. So these are the sorts of pieces of evidence that de Waal's looking at here. He points out when we look at chimpanzee archaeology, we see evidence of chimpanzees with deformities that would have never permitted them to survive until adulthood unless they were provisioned by other members of their community as evidence for empathy and helping behavior as well. He points to evidence of cooperation. And he shows a video from the 1930s of two baby chimpanzees pulling on a rope together to acquire food. Elephants will do this too. He studied fairness in chimpanzees and in monkeys and dogs and corvids and children all seem to have a response, a negative response to, say, getting less than a colleague for doing the same job. And that in chimpanzees and kids older than 7 and in adults, we seem to anticipate disharmony if we take a greater share than our cohorts. So all of this sort of stuff, de Waal says, look, animals, they're naturally good, kind of good. They have shoots of sprouts of morality, the way Mengzi would have it. But as, and also, this has also been happening with research in children. So Kylie Hamlin and Paul Bloom and Karen Wynn looking at moral development in children. Their studies, they interpret their studies as showing that by 4 months, 4.5 months, infants are showing prosocial attitudes. They prefer helpers to hinders. They distinguish between individuals who try to help and individuals who don't try to help. And they will give cookies to helpers and not to the hinders. And anecdotally, sometimes they'll punch the hinders and beat them up. And Paul Bloom, in a New York Times article, is quoted as saying, "You can see glimmers of moral thought, moral judgment, and moral feeling even in the first year of life." So very Mengzi, natural morality sort of sentiment here. But of course, Sun Tzu is right too. Infants are also naturally horrible, selfish creatures. We have inclinations for selfishness and profit as well as sympathy. Infants are greedy. They want their cookies. They want their milk. They want their mom, right? So untrained humans, I think that Sun Tzu is right, have both. And that morality, if we think about this idea that morality is a cultural technology like agriculture, we can give, I think, a more thorough investigation into the evolution of morality by looking at evidence for this technology in other species. So another reason I like this idea of Sun Tzu's is that, Mengzi's view, morality is easy. It's like water running downhill. But as we know, especially I think today, morality can be hard. It can be really hard to do the right thing in the face of a lot of power against doing the right thing. So it takes work and effort and stresses people out sometimes to do what's right. So, thank you, Sun Tzu, for reminding us that it's not always easy to do the right thing. So morality as cultural technology. This is the kind of path we're going to take in this investigation. But there's a prima facie worry about examining the evolution of morality as cultural technology by looking at non-human animals, and that is that maybe animals aren't cultural species, right? Because if morality is a cultural technology, then any species with morality has got to be a cultural species. And if animals aren't, then maybe our starting premise is wrong, or then don't look at animals. And so I'll just start with a statement to this effect, because you might think, oh no, animals are cultural creatures. There's been a lot of press lately about culture and other animals, but Joseph Henrich, in his book from last year, The Secret of Our Success, starts from this premise that humans, the secret, you want to know the answer, the secret of our success? Gene, culture, coevolution, right? That humans are the only cultural species. So he says in this book, the wrong way to understand humans is to think that we're just a really smart, though somewhat less hairy chimpanzee. The difference is we're cultural, they're not. And he starts his book out with this kind of thought experiment where you take a bunch of humans and you take a bunch of monkeys and you take them out of their environment and throw them in a new environment, and then you come back in a year and see who survives. His hypothesis is the humans will not flourish, but the monkeys will, because humans rely so much on cultural technology that wouldn't exist in this new context, whereas monkeys do not rely on cultural technology, so they'll be able to flourish in novel contexts. And I think that this is absolutely wrong. And a prima facie reason to think that this is wrong is looking at rehabilitant animals. So for example, rehabilitant orangutans in Borneo. This is a picture I took of 2 orangutans being taught by Wiwik, a human babysitter, at a forest school. So in these forest schools, you have orangutans who have not been raised by their mother because of various terrible things happening. They're being raised by humans in a human context and put in cages. And then you want to put them back into the forest. But you can't just put them back into a forest from a cage because they don't know what to eat. They don't know how to process the food that they need to eat. They don't know how to climb trees without breaking them. They don't know the traditional routes to take. They don't know where the fruiting trees are and when the trees fruit. There's all of this knowledge that these orangutans don't have, which is why the best practices for reintroduction projects are to have forest schools where people like Wewick show these two orangutans how to process ginger shoots, which is one of their primary food sources in East Kalimantan. And you see that there's this close peering behavior that's characteristic of orangutans when they're learning a new task. And you see this with orangutan mothers and their offspring too. There's this very close attention and tolerance of the mother for this kind of close attention. So even prima facie, you throw the orangutans into the forest without forest school, they die. And this is why the best practices are to teach them what to eat and so on and so forth. But there's other reasons to think that there are there's culture in, say, at least non-human primate. I'm only going to talk about non-human primates right now. So, and a lot of this evidence is just preliminary because we haven't been looking at these things for very long. So there's a new field of primate archaeology that's looking at stone tool use and examining the different kinds of tools that are being used by different species for different practices. So this study is a study of the stone tools used by the Burmese long-tailed macaques on the coast. They use two different tools. They use an axe tool to hammer oysters and a pound tool to open unattached encased foods. And what they did in the study is develop this use action index in order to differentiate the different kinds of tools and the kind of markings on them in order to categorize them. So what they want to do is go back and look at other tools at sites that are no longer being used by the macaques and see if they can find a progression in how these tools were used. And this is the first study to demonstrate that you can do this kind of use where analysis on the on tools used by non-humans, hominids. So the stuff that's been getting a lot of press is the cultural variations research in great apes. These are just a couple of pictures of some traditional behaviors like the hand clasp grooming that Jane Goodall identified in the chimpanzees at Gombe. Other chimpanzees communities do not hold hands when they groom. But just recently, just last year, it was reported that some communities of chimpanzees throw big stones at special trees so that the stones gather in these hollows. They don't know why. It might be to make a big sound. It might be for some other reason. They're not sure, but this is a behavior that's unique to certain communities. And then this report from 2014 about a community of chimpanzees where the alpha female started putting a piece of straw in her ear, and then everyone else started putting a piece of straw in her ear. Right, so these are not just behaviors that are functional. In 2001, Andy Whitten and colleagues compiled a list of the different cultural behaviors that they observed. There were 65 behaviors at that point, including differences in tool use and grooming and courtship behaviors that you see in some communities and not in others. And since then, there have been a lot more, but nobody has published a report on how many of these there are. We just continue finding more and more differences. Also, I mean, one of the things you want if you're engaged in thinking about culture is you want some evidence of teaching. And there was never any video evidence of teaching in great apes before. You might say that doesn't look like teaching to me, but according to the definition of teaching that has been used in this field for a long time, where you reduce your own fitness in order to increase the fitness of your offspring, handing a tool over like this, like the mom is doing to her offspring. I'll just play it again. You want to see it? So the offspring reaches for the tool, mom gives it to the kid, and then the kid's using it to fish for termites. And mom makes herself another one. And the next picture, you see the older juvenile coming to the mom, wanting the tool. Mom splits the tool in half and gives half of it to the offspring, who then goes and uses it to fish for termites in the same hole. So this is super novel behavior that was recorded for the first time. And then also what people are starting to discover is chimpanzees using sets of tools. So instead of just using an ant dipper or a termite dipper, they're using a tool to open a hole, another tool to enlarge the hole, and a third tool to collect the insects. There's also Cricket Sands at the Guadalupe Triangle, where you saw those videos were from. She has also documented the use of a creation of a tool to make another tool. So these sorts of behaviors are looking more like cumulative culture, which is something we have not seen in non-human animal species before. For a long time, people have said, and people are still saying, that there's not cumulative culture in these other animals. But I think as we spend more and more time in the field watching what they do, we start to see evidence that it does look like there's something like that going on. So I think that we have to say that at least some other animals are cultural, and then we can move on to our next question. Do animals have a moral or normative cultural technology? So what is morality and what is normativity? These are huge questions. And what I'm doing at this point, in order to kind of demarcate the moral and the normative, is I've adopted a definition of morality that Margaret Urban Walker uses in her book, Moral Understandings, A Feminist Study in Ethics. And the reason why, there are a number of reasons why I'm using her account of the moral. One is that she emphasizes practices as opposed to principles. Another is that she emphasizes that morality is going to be something that's culturally and socially bound. And that then you've got these more kind of traditional views that it's about responsibility and it's something that's taught and defended, and you've got corrections and so on and so forth. And the reason why I like these is that if you're going to be looking for non-intellectualist accounts of morality in creatures that don't use language, you probably aren't going to be looking for, principles. So it's useful for that reason. Now, what's normativity? Well, we can, at this point, just say I just mean oughtness, prescriptivity, valuing that ought to be sought, that need not be focused on responsibility or anything like that. So if you like the moral conventional distinction, you can think of normativity as including the conventional sort of norms, as well as the moral. So in this sense, I mean, normativity is a broader category of ought thought than moral thinking. And what I want to do is look first at evidence of normativity, for the existence of normativity in other animals, before we answer any questions about moral practice or moral norms. And in order to do that, I want to look at two different things. One is what I think of as the cognitive modality required for normative thinking, which I call naive normativity, and then look for evidence of social norms having to do with responsibility, whether or not they're taught or not taught. So this cognitive capacity of primitive normativity, I think of it as a mode of thinking, like thinking about the past or thinking about the future, or episodic thinking or counterfactual thinking. It's just thinking in shoulds as opposed to thinking in ises. So naive normativity, you can kind of state it, or I've been stating it, as how we should do things around here. And it's inspired by Hannah Ginsburg, though I'm taking Hannah Ginsburg to a place that she doesn't want to go. So I have to acknowledge her influence on me, but not put any responsibility on her at all for what I'm saying, because I think she disagrees with a lot of what I want to say here. At least she did a couple of years ago. So an understanding of the way we do things around here, which doesn't depend on conformity to some sort of rule that you have in mind already. Ginsburg gives some really nice examples of what she calls primitive normativity in children. In the case of like a little kid just sitting with a pile of blocks, some are red and some are blue, and they just start sorting them into piles of blue and piles of red. And this is the way that the kid thinks these things should be organized. If an adult would come and mess things up, the kid would have a fit. There's not a rule, there's not a cultural practice, there's nothing. It's just this sense that there's going to be a right way to do things, and this is what it happens to be. But I think that when we look at this as a cognitive modality, what we can do is think of it in terms of of actual cognitive development in children and perhaps in other species as well. So the first start would be a recognition of in-group and out-group distinctions, because if naive normativity is how we do things around here, then there's got to be an understanding of what the we is. And then there's got to be training or past experience by the in-group, some kind of social learning ability, and then some sort of disposition to go on in the right way. So you can socially learn some practice, but not care that that's how they do it around here, or that's how we do it. I'm doing it my own way. So there's some kind of drive to do it the group way, and some sort of consciousness of appropriateness or ability to, a response to corrections and protests of wrong ways of doing things. All right, so when we look for evidence of this kind of cognitive lens in other animals, I think we can understand these four aspects in the ways I have on the slide here. So recognition of in-group, out-group. There's some formal studies, but there's also naturalistic observations of chimpanzee behavior that chimpanzees engage in-group, out-group thinking because they go to war and they protect their territory. And males will gather and walk along the edges of their territory and sometimes have incursions into the neighboring territory and kill the males and the infants and take females back to their territory, or they will enlarge their territory. John Matani does this sort of research. It's very hard to have a war without some recognition of these are my people and those are your people. So there's a picture. Do you want to see it? Of war and killing?
Yeah.
If you don't want to see it, don't look. Here you go. I mean, it's wow. There's this, sometimes they'll just mutilate the males by like chewing off their testicles, or So there's this target. The target is the males, and the infants are not good because they keep the females from being sexually receptive again. So they like to kill off both of those. So there's these idea that there are a difference between in-groups and out-groups, where there's evidence of social learning. So I've got the ear-wearing behavior again. But also in Capuchin monkeys, so there's social learning of useful things, but there's also social learning of things that aren't very useful at all. And the Capuchin monkeys, I really like. Susan Perry's done this research on the monkeys they're very spastic species. They move around a lot, high energy. And she's reported that in one community of Capuchin monkeys, she observed dyads going off into the edge of the group, away from everyone else, and going up onto a branch and engaging in this behavior where they stick their fingers up one another's nostrils and sway back and forth. Like clearly not functional behavior. And so she's like, well, what is this for? Why are they doing this? And maybe they do it for the same reason humans open their mouths up and stick them together and stick their tongues in there. Like some sort of bonding ritual of disgust. And then this is both social learning and wanting to go on in the group way. Victoria Horner did, back in 2006, a number of studies about manipulation of an apparatus that could be opened in 2 different ways to access food. And there are 2 different communities of chimpanzees. So community A, the first model was taught one way, and community B, the first model was taught the other way, and then they allowed other individuals to observe the model, and then the secondary model, and so on and so forth. And what she found is that through these 2 communities, the modeled behavior is what spread through the community, even though the other way of manipulating the apparatus also was discovered. So it's not that they didn't know how to slide the door when they were modeled lift, but they preferred to lift because that's the way the dominants were doing it in their community. It was the dominant who was the first model, and then the second level watched the dominant, and so on and so forth throughout the chain. And then this is a less known study. Erica de Waal, who's no relation to Frans de Waal, did a naturalistic study that it's one of these beautiful cases of science working out right for you when you didn't plan it at all. So she was doing a study on mother-infant acquisition of behavior, and it turned out to be something much different. So she was provisioning wild vervet monkeys with corn that were dyed pink or blue, and in different communities, the pink corn also tasted terrible, and the other community, the blue corn, also tasted terrible. So she habituated the adults on these corns, and then she made them so they didn't taste terrible. They both tasted the same, but they were just different color. And what she found is that the infants started eating the colored corn that the parents ate. No one in this group wanted the blue corn because at first it tasted terrible, and now everyone, including infants, only eat the pink corn. But what they found when vervet males immigrate to other communities, luckily the pink males went to the blue group and the blue males went to the pink group. And she found that the male immigrants shifted their behavior to correspond to the behavior of their new community. They assimilated into their immigrant culture. So, there might be different explanations for what's going on, but it looks like there was some sort of, and there was no sort of enforcement of eating one color corn or another. Their behavior switched as if to correspond to what the high-ranking individuals are doing, because when you immigrate into a group, you're low-ranking. And then consciousness of appropriateness. There's not a lot as far as protesting norms go. I'll say a little bit more later, but there's some anecdotal reports, and this is an orangutan named Day Day. It was a 6-year-old rehab orangutan that my colleague Ann Russin was working with on a do as I do sort of paradigm, so imitation paradigm. Anne had shells of coconuts and jackfruit seeds, and she was putting one coconut shell down and a jackfruit seed in, and then gave it to Day Day. And Day Day put the seeds in one place and the shells in another place, and then Anne tried to do things the way that she wanted to do things, and he protested. He protested her way of doing things. Anne says it was as if he thought, "Oh, you're so dumb, why are you doing it this way when obviously it's supposed to go this way?" I'll say a little bit more later. All right, so I think that, it's super quick to just go through some evidence and with a bunch of different species, but I hope at least that there's some reason to think that there's something like these capacities for recognizing in-group, out-group, social learning. There might be some sort of disposition to go on in the group way, and consciousness of the right way of doing things, and maybe even in some cases protesting of violations even when they seem to be somewhat arbitrary. Now I'm going to go even kind of sketchier and go to the social norms, the evidence for social norms, at least some prima facie evidence. And this is the work that I'm doing with my student Rebecca Ring, who's interested in the cetaceans, and former postdoc Sarah Vincent. So on the Mengzi model of morality, the ethologist Mark Beckhoff and the philosopher Jessica Pierce. They've identified clusters of moral behavior. They describe them as the cooperation cluster, the empathy cluster, and the justice cluster. And so this sounds a lot like DeWall's sort of picture, empathy and fairness and justice and so on. But this, I think, misses on a lot of other sorts of social norms that anthropologists and psychologists have been interested in. So Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations, and Krebs and, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Janicki. Their work on categories of moral norms that we might see include things like obedience norms, as well as reciprocity norms and care-based and altruistic norms, and norms of solidarity as well. And what I think expanding these accounts from just the kind of empathy, altruism cluster to these other sorts of things like solidarity and obedience is that you see more of a range of behaviors that might count as moral when you understand moral as in terms of some sort of cognitive technology, even if they're not nice, even if it's pictures of chimpanzee war going on. That's not something DeWall is saying, oh look, aren't chimpanzees moral because they go to war? But maybe that's exactly what we should be looking at, and that's what we're working on. So following Krebs and Janicki, we identify these 5 different kinds of social norms that are related to morality, obedience, reciprocity, care, social responsibility, and solidarity. And what we've done is gone through the literature, and what we're working on is going through the literature and looking for evidence of these in cetaceans and in great apes, chimpanzees in particular. And so I'm not going to go through, we've got these tables in case you're interested. You can see our preliminary work, but by obedience norms, we're looking at things like, and this is Krebs and Janicki, displays of authority and respect, policing, subversion, such as when a pack leaders police and interrupt sex acts between subversive female wolves in the pack and male outsiders, demonstrations of guilt by an agent, which can include things like displays of submission in response to correction, like when a dog tucks her tail when being scolded for toppling the trash. Or the meting out of punishments, such as when chimpanzees destroy food that was taken by a thieving conspecific, so nobody gets the food. Or more general teaching and obedience cases, like non-moral cases of teaching practices, instructing someone how to use a tool and praising successful usage of the tool, things like that. So in the sort of evidence we have about chimpanzees, I'll just quickly mention, we have some evidence of teaching by inhibition, by pulling an individual away from an act. Mothers will do this if their offspring is doing something dangerous. They'll pull their infant away from, say, a plant that's not normally in their diet, or when infants are playing with dangerous objects. And as far as reciprocity norms go, we can see, I'll just, instead of going through so much, we can see evidence of this in the sort of coordination behavior when chimpanzees work together in order to access food. So this is, the picture is of an apparatus where there's one rope, and if just one individual pulls the rope, they get the rope. Both individuals need to pull the rope at the same time in order to access the food. And in some studies using the style of apparatus, when it's just freely out in the community, they've observed groups of 2 or 3 individuals going together to get the food, and sometimes soliciting help to go and get the food, and sometimes even soliciting help and getting help from individuals who don't end up eating the food at the end of the day. Also, the sort of reciprocity we see is there's some evidence that chimpanzees in long-term relationships, like friend relationships, share food and grooming, keep track of the food that they give and the grooming that they give each other. care norms. These are the ones that there's a lot of because of the interest from the Mengzi approach to studying animal morality. So I won't say too much about this, but just one example that I like is a community of chimpanzees where they live in an area with a lot of humans and a lot of roads and a lot of people on roads and cars on roads. And so they've developed a way of dealing with roads by crossing the street with the alpha male in the front, another high-ranking male in the middle, and the women and children, and the other high-ranking male at the end, and women and children, females and children in the middle. So it's sort of protecting behavior of more vulnerable members of the community. Social responsibility norms. This is, again, I think an example of a protest. The case I'm going to talk about here is when chimpanzees observe infanticide. Infanticide happens in chimpanzee communities. It's not very common, but there have been a number of reports lately that chimpanzees, when they see, chimpanzee females, when they see a male treating infants in a way that's too rough, they will start to protest, they'll vocalize, and they'll vocalize even if they're not related to the infant, and groups of females will intervene, vocalize and intervene, and stop the male's treatment. And there have been some other studies, again, suggesting that there's some sort of norm against infanticide that's being promoted, and that violations of this are being responded to. And then solidarity norms would be, one example of this would be the boundary patrol behavior that I talked about earlier, when chimpanzees together, chimpanzee males will quietly patrol the boundaries of their communities to watch out for what's going on in the neighboring communities. So, I mean, that super kind of quick run through of some reasons why we might think that there are social norms in chimpanzees. And it's a taste of the sort of work that I'm asking, not just that we conclude, okay, it's done, we know that there are social norms in chimpanzees, but the sort of thing that we need to look for, and I mean, not just in the literature, but when we're in the field and running experiments, the sort of things that we can continue to investigate in order to answer this question, whether or not chimpanzees engage in social norms, as opposed to going the Mengzi route and just looking and seeing how nice and friendly they are. So I think that what we have is some evidence that some animals, some chimpanzees at least, engage in normative practice, but none of this has been evidence of moral practice, right? There's no moral judgment, there's nothing about being taught and defended, any sort of practices that are going on. But as far as normativity goes, I think that at least we have reason. I'm hoping at least you will say, maybe. And if you don't want to say maybe, then I just want to point out that, guess what? We just found out that there's like a new gibbon. There's a new species of gibbon we didn't know exists. This is the Skywalker hooklock gibbon that's just been identified. Our science of other species is still really, really young. And it's, I think, premature to make any sort of claims about the non-existence of something. We need to keep looking. So I'll end with that, and thank you for your attention.
So now I forgot, she said, do we take questions first or do we take the break first?
We have reception first.
We have to have the reception first. So we're going to take a quick reception in this down this hallway. Come in and have some nibbles and some drink, and we'll come back. And with